They called her a queen, a goddess of the Nile. Yet in the end, Cleopatra was defined by a single fracture, the inability to master her own desire. Her final chapter was never about conquering Rome. It was about losing the one thing she feared surrendering most, her own self. Today, we uncover what Roman history tried to bury: Cleopatra's secret, the psychological key that carried her to timeless power and then betrayed her in her last act. This is not a history lesson. It is a descent into the analytical psychology of Carl Jung. Cleopatra is not just a life to be remembered. She is the archetype of the tragic lover. She carried an animus, raw, strategic, imperial, so fierce it bent emperors to her will. But she failed, profoundly, to integrate her anima, the quiet force of connection, of feeling, of inner truth. Her destiny mirrors our own. We will unveil the collective shadow that condemned her, the ancient fear of a woman who wields love as a weapon, yet becomes trapped by the very strategy she believes she controls. We will see how her search for wholeness, her self, collapsed when she projected that wholeness onto Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Cleopatra's journey is a warning, a whisper that power is eternal only when it arises from within. If you seek the strength of your own wholeness, if you feel the pull of your inner awakening, do not walk into this journey alone. Subscribe now to Shadow Work Stories, so the algorithm understands the urgency of this archaical unveiling. Activate the bell to receive our next descent. Leave your like, and together we'll uncover Cleopatra's secret and the key to never repeating her final mistake. Her first and most brutal act of ambition wasn't political at all. It was an act of psychological survival. Cleopatra rose to power in a world where strength, law, reason, and discernment belonged entirely to the masculine principle, the logos. To rule, she needed an unshakable animus, the inner masculine of the feminine psyche. But as a woman in a world ruled by men, she attempted a perilous solution. She projected that animus outward, instead of integrating it within. Picture the palace, not as a place of luxury, but as a battlefield. Cleopatra needed a collective persona, an immaculate facade of power, purity, and divine right. She cloaked herself as the goddess Isis, the emblem of sacred femininity and fertile authority. Yet this was only a mask. Underneath it lived the truth. She did not feel safe in her own power. She needed a co-ruler, a husband, a general. She needed a vessel outside herself to contain the animus that, if fully revealed in her own person, would have condemned her to destruction under Roman judgment. Julius Caesar was not simply a general. He embodied the archetype of the father for Roman civilization, the pinnacle of authority, discipline, order, the logos in its purest form. By seducing him, Cleopatra wasn't merely securing her throne. She was symbolically wedding herself to authority, reason, and the power to act, forces her culture denied her. The famed seduction, romanticized by history, was in truth a cold act of psychic survival. She wielded her Eros, the principle of connection, sensuality, and emotional depth, the only tool of influence patriarchy allowed women to command Caesar's masculine logos. Cleopatra was never a woman of love. She was a strategist of her own soul. She surrendered herself to Caesar not out of blind passion, but to internalize wholeness through union. She projected onto him the image of an invincible self, the man who could validate her ambition and shield her from the collective shadow that saw her only as an exotic and disposable queen. Yet dependency was the seed of tragedy. With each triumph of Caesar, Cleopatra's animus seemed to grow stronger. She didn't need to fight on the battlefield. She believed she controlled it through mind and flesh. This was the lie she whispered to herself, that her power was inseparable from his. But the price of this forced projection was steep, the loss of her own identity. By outsourcing her strength, Cleopatra blocked her individuation, the path toward becoming whole. She was prevented from being seen as the strategist, the diplomat, the complete sovereign. She was reduced to a single archetypal silhouette, the lover, powerful, yet orbiting eternally around a man. Carl Jung taught that the shadow is the vast storehouse of all traits and abilities we refuse to claim. Cleopatra's shadow was not her sexuality, it was her fear of autonomy and her profound need for protection. She feared being the sole source of her own power. She feared the void of ruling alone. By projecting her animus onto Caesar, she also, ironically, projected her dependency, her shadow, into the relationship. Her fragility became his. Society, blinded by its own shadow, the fear of a woman with power, could never see Cleopatra as the bearer of totality. It saw only the lover, the temptress. And she accepted that persona, because beneath the mask of Isis lingered one terrible question: what if my power is not enough? The assassination of Caesar shattered the psychic structure she had built. Her external source of power, her projected animus, was ripped away. The emptiness that followed was not merely grief, it was the primal terror of needing to find strength within. Cleopatra had proved she could conquer the most powerful man in the world. But when the dagger entered Caesar, it pierced through her illusion as well. She stood alone, exposed, with the shadow of dependency waiting to devour her. What she did next was not mourning, it was calculated desperation. She needed a new vessel, a new hero to carry the self she refused to claim. And she found him in a man who embodied the opposite of Caesar, Mark Antony. But what was she truly seeking in Antony? Wholeness or a political weapon? And what tragedy was destined to unfold when the archetype of the lover collided with the archetype of the soldier? Their relationship, Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, was the living embodiment of one of humanity's oldest archetypal tensions, the collision and the attempted union of Eros, the feminine principle of connection, feeling, intuition, life, and sacred sexuality, with Logos, the masculine principle of law, reason, structure, discernment, and hierarchical power. Caesar was Logos incarnate, Roman military order, cold rationality, imposed law. He was the superego of Western civilization, obsessed with conquest, clarity, and control. Cleopatra, in contrast, was overflowing Eros, the Egyptian mystery, the Nile's abundance, emotional intelligence, intuitive gnosis. When they met, it wasn't merely political strategy. It was a synchronistic event seeking, unconsciously, the psychic wholeness of their world. In Jungian terms, their union became a partnership of two immense egos reaching toward the self, wholeness, through each other. Cleopatra projected onto Caesar the authority, the animus, that protected and validated her intuitive gnosis of rulership. Caesar projected onto her the anima, the mysterious, intuitive, vital feminine, long suppressed within Roman militaristic culture. Their attraction was not only for power, it was for completeness. Each saw in the other what they lacked. Cleopatra. She saw in Caesar's logos the anchor for her ambition. She wanted Roman law to safeguard her Egyptian myth. She pulled him into Egypt, forcing logos to bow to Eros. Caesar, he saw in Cleopatra's Eros the release from rigidity. With her, he allowed himself luxury, mysticism, free sensuality, everything his Roman persona forbade. He brought her to Rome, forcing Eros to confront the iron framework of Logos. But archetypal unions turn dangerous when psychic energy becomes completely projected outward. Cleopatra began to believe her power could not exist without Caesar. Her individuation froze. She believed wholeness would come through the union of bodies, not the union of souls. And in doing so, her shadow, her fear of being stripped of power, her dependency grew alongside her influence. The Logos of Rome, the rigid Senate, the legal machinery that refused to bow to foreign royalty, could not tolerate such a union. What Rome feared in Cleopatra was not just the foreign queen, it was the woman who dared to corrupt Logos with Eros. It was the collective Roman shadow, terrified of chaos, intuition, and the collapse of its masculine hierarchy. The birth of Caesarion, son of Cleopatra and Caesar, was her final attempt to materialize wholeness, the self. To Cleopatra, the child was living proof that Logos and Eros could merge into one being, securing her eternal power. In Jungian symbolism, an archetypal child represents new consciousness, the living synthesis of opposites. He should have been the sign that integration was possible. Instead, he became the greatest threat. By giving birth to the symbol of totality, Cleopatra became a danger not just to Roman politics, but to Roman metaphysics. The self, in feminine form, was asserting itself, and Rome's collective ego could not permit it. Cleopatra's life in Rome became a dazzling, provocative persona. She wielded Egyptian symbols to challenge Roman rigidity. She planted the sacred feminine, Eros, at the heart of the empire of Logos. But she was also living inside a grand illusion. So immersed in her projection onto Caesar, she failed to see that he, Logos incarnate, was vulnerable to his own shadow, the temptation of monarchy. The assassination of Caesar by Brutus and Cassius was not merely political treason, it was the collapse of the wholeness Cleopatra had constructed. Her projected animus was annihilated, leaving behind a terrorizing void. She fled Rome with her son, carrying in her arms both the symbol of wholeness and the evidence of her deepest vulnerability. The emptiness left by Caesar was not the end of Cleopatra's power. It was the beginning of her most painful lesson in individuation. The psychic force she had projected outward needed to be recalled, reclaimed, internalized. But the fear of loss was greater than the courage to become whole. Instead of turning inward and integrating her own animus, she reached, once again, desperately, for a new vessel. and she found one in a man who was Caesar's perfect opposite, not cold Logos, but wounded Eros. Antony was powerful yet breakable, a general who could be bent. But the tragedy that followed would be far greater. What was Cleopatra truly seeking in Antony, and how did her Eros, when fused with Antony's shadow, bring ruin to them both? Unleashing the archetype of the tragic lover in its most destructive form. The answer lies in the dance of Mark Antony's repressed anima. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra once again stood before the void, that primal terror of having to uphold her own wholeness, her own self. Her instinctive answer was not inner integration, but a desperate search for a new, more malleable vessel to carry her projected animus. And that is where Mark Antony enters. The strong general, yes, but emotionally exposed, spiritually hungry, inwardly collapsing. Antony was the antithesis of Caesar. Caesar was cold Logos, calculated, disciplined, governed by reason. Antony was the warrior of passion, the battle-scarred hero yearning for release. His ego was exhausted by Rome's rigid military persona. He carried a repressed anima, the feminine side of his psyche starving for intuition, pleasure, emotional depth, and the breaking of rules. Cleopatra, master of archetypal seduction, did not lure him with politics. She offered him psychic liberation. Not just a kingdom, but a sanctuary of Eros, a world where Rome's laws, its iron Logos, could not restrain him. Their relationship was, at its core, a mutual projection of shadow. Shadow is not only darkness, it is everything the ego refuses to see in itself. Antony's shadow, a wild anima, the craving for hedonism, for surrender, for the great mother's comfort, and for the rejection of Rome's masculine responsibilities. He projected onto Cleopatra the libertine lover, the woman who permitted him to break every rule. Cleopatra's shadow, emotional dependency and the fear of autonomy. She projected onto Antony the strong warrior who would save her, but who could also be easily bent by her femininity. She wielded Eros to dominate his weakened animus. What bloomed in Alexandria was not love, it was a neurotic symbiosis. Cleopatra was unconsciously siphoning Antony's strength to fuel her own, while Antony was spilling his repressed anima onto her, using her as the excuse for his moral and military decline. The dance of Antony's repressed anima became unmistakable. He began dressing like an Egyptian god, joining ritualistic ceremonies, neglecting his military duties. He was drowning in Egypt's collective unconscious, the realm of the primordial feminine. His ego dissolved into indulgence. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar, Logos, was rigid but structured. Her relationship with Antony, Eros, was chaotic and self-destructive. They sought wholeness through passion, but passion without Logos becomes mania. The risk Cleopatra took was catastrophic. In trying to control the Roman general through Eros, she turned her greatest weapon into her most fatal weakness. She became the tragic lover not because she loved too intensely, but because she depended too intensely on the object she sought to control. Her persona as goddess pharaoh demanded dominance. Her shadow demanded safety through another. Roman society, Rome's collective shadow, led by Octavian, the new cold and implacable Logos, could not tolerate the union of runaway Eros with a broken Animus. Their scandal wasn't just political, it was a threat to Rome's psychic order. The demonization of Cleopatra as the witch who bewitched the general was a collective psychological projection. Rome needed a scapegoat for the chaos it refused to recognize in itself. When Octavian attacked, he didn't just strike Antony's army, he struck at the shadow Antony and Cleopatra embodied. His assault was Logos, punishing unrestrained Eros. The defeat at Actium was not only military, it was proof that a wholeness built on projected shadow, dependency, and hedonism cannot stand. Antony's animus, drained by excess Eros, collapsed at the decisive moment, leading to cowardly flight and the downfall of them both. Their retreat after Actium was the prelude to catastrophe, the tragic lover and the fallen warrior returning to Egypt to face their final adversary, solitude. Cleopatra's punishment would not come from Octavian, but from her own ego, an ego incapable of accepting defeat. And now she stands at the threshold of her last trial, the confrontation with her true shadow. Her return to Alexandria after the defeat at Actium marked the collapse of the goddess-pharaoh persona and the awakening of the archetype of the tragic lover in its purest, most unforgiving form. In Jungian depth psychology, this archetype is not defined by infidelity or romance, but by the desperate pursuit of wholeness, the self, through another person, a pursuit that ends in the loss of one's own autonomy. Cleopatra had wagered everything on Eros, manipulative, strategic, intoxicating, to command Rome's military Logos. She believed totality lived inside the archetypal union with Antony, the man who carried her projected animus. Actium shattered that illusion. From this moment on, the fear that shadowed her life, the terror of ultimate abandonment, and the void of certainty rose from her unconscious and seized her reality. She found herself alone, exposed, stripped of the masculine scaffolding she had trained herself to depend upon. Cleopatra, the ruthless strategist, began to move chaotically, irrationally. She tried to escape, to rebuild an empire in the south, even to negotiate with the very power hunting her. These were not political tactics. They were the last desperate contortions of an ego clinging to external power. The void of certainty is the moment when the seeker confronts the terrifying possibility that their entire journey was built on illusion. For Cleopatra, it was the moment her ego was forced to shed its final projections. While Antony lived, the danger remained. The danger of projecting her inner divinity, herself, onto him. Now the void demanded she reclaim it. This was Cleopatra's dark night of the soul. She had to prove that her faith, in her power, in her destiny, in her sovereignty, arose from inner experience, not from an external figure. But Logos, embodied by Octavian's cold Roman logic, whispered that without proof, without victory, without a man, her truth did not exist. The void activated the primordial fear of being abandoned by one's own truth. To Cleopatra's inner child, the wounded one, the void looked like death. It was the ego's last attempt to cling to the safety of an external source. The fear of the void is where most people retreat, returning to the comfort of dogma and dependency. But Cleopatra was trapped. Her ego feared the shadow of absolute aloneness, the brutal recognition that truth is often a path for the few. Her suffering was the ancestral suffering of every woman whose intuition was called hysteria, whose power was labeled curse or sin. The apex of the tragic archetype is inevitable betrayal or loss. Antony's suicide was the second and most devastating collapse of her projected animus. He did not just leave her physically, he left her with the guilt and fragility of her own shadow. Her mourning was not only for the man, it was for the collapse of the object of her projection. And this collapse was absolutely necessary for her individuation. The void he left behind whispered, "Wholeness is not outside you. Wholeness is you." This was the true turning point in Cleopatra's soul narrative. Now she faced a radical choice: to surrender to the void and discover her fullness, or make one last attempt to bargain with her persona. In surrendering to the void, she found fullness. She stopped seeking proof in the past and opened herself to the current of what awaited her. And now she had to face Octavian, cold Logos, in one final, desperate encounter. What could the Queen of Egypt, stripped of army and animus, possibly try to sell to her most relentless enemy? What could she bargain with when all she had left was her persona? And why did her last attempt at seduction, the final weapon of her manipulative anima, fail so completely against Octavian's pure reason, pushing her toward a final, dramatic act of autonomy? The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was not merely a naval disaster. It was the collapse of the wholeness, the totality, that Cleopatra and Antony had tried to construct through mutual projection. The defeat materialized in perfect synchronicity, the psychic disarray that had been festering beneath the surface of their union. What truly died at Actium was not ships or soldiers, but Cleopatra's projected animus, that reservoir of power, strategy, and discernment she had outsourced to Antony. And Antony's ego, finally crushed beneath the weight of his repressed anima and Cleopatra's emotional domination, died with it. In Jungian terms, the animus holds judgment, courage, and spiritual authority. But Antony, swallowed by Cleopatra's chaotic and hedonistic Eros, lost his tactical clarity. His decision to abandon the battle and flee was a complete collapse of Logos. The general, who once embodied Roman military reason, became the caricature of emotional chaos. When Cleopatra fled with him, she was not saving a lover. She was desperately clinging to the last vessel of her projected power. Their return to Egypt was drenched in denial, a final attempt to construct a new persona of resistance. Antony's final act, his coerced suicide, was the second and most devastating psychic blow. It was the definitive death of Cleopatra's projection. The wholeness she pursued had been annihilated before her eyes. Her grief was the grief of losing the vessel that carried the power she refused to embody. From a Jungian perspective, Antony, archetypally, fulfilled his role as the guide toward the self by dying. The psychic energy Cleopatra had projected outward could now only return inward. His body disappeared so she could finally seek the spirit, the inner authority within herself. The void he left did not pose a question, it issued a command. Totality is not outside. Totality is you. This is the peak of the tragic lover archetype. She can no longer be the queen who depends. She must become the woman who is her own authority. Her final confrontation is not with death, it is with Octavian. Octavian was the new logos of Rome, cold, immaculate, seemingly without shadow, a man entirely integrated into rationality and emptied of anima. In her cell, Cleopatra attempted the last gesture of her old persona. She reached for her legendary Eros, seduction, emotional intelligence, sacred mystique, and aimed it at her conqueror. She tried to sell Octavian the same promise she had once sold Caesar and Antony, the illusion of totality that only she could offer. But Octavian was immune. He required no external Eros. He was the purest embodiment of logos, stripped of softness, intuition, and vulnerability. His refusal to be seduced was Cleopatra's final awakening. Her last weapon, the manipulation of the masculine anima, had failed. And this failure forced her into radical self-acceptance. She saw clearly, her truth belonged to no one but herself. Her own validation was the only authority she had ever needed. The failure to sway Octavian was paradoxically the final triumph of her individuation. She understood that the power she had sought in men could never be projected, negotiated, or purchased. Actium's defeat and Octavian's rejection freed her from her last dependency. The queen who had tried to conquer the world through men now stood before the necessity of conquering herself. Wholeness emerged at last, not through life, but through death. The only way to preserve her spiritual sovereignty was to deny Octavian the right to touch her, to define her, to parade her as a trophy of his logos. And so the serpent, the symbol of the primordial feminine, of forbidden knowledge, of cyclical rebirth, slithered toward its destined role. But what does the serpent represent in the end? Is it surrender to death? Or the final act of autonomy, the absolute refusal to let the logos of Rome command her soul? The answer lies in the archetypal command, Noli me tangere, do not touch me. Cleopatra's last lesson in true freedom. Cleopatra's encounter with Octavian after Antony's suicide was the point of no return in her psychic journey. She stood stripped of army, husband, and projected animus. All that remained was her most legendary weapon, the persona of the seductress, the goddess pharaoh, the queen of enchantment. The persona is the mask the psyche wears to meet the world's expectations. Cleopatra's persona was an almost alchemical blend of political intelligence, a shard of her logos, and magnetic sensuality, her manipulated Eros. This mask had worked against Caesar's weakened logos and Antony's overflowing, wounded Eros. So, in one last desperate maneuver, she lifted the mask again and attempted to wield it against the coldest face of Roman reason. She presented herself to Octavian at her most radiant, surrounded by Egyptian symbols, hoping to ignite once more the dynamic of the tragic lover. She tried to sell Octavian the same promise she once made to Caesar, the vision of totality he suppressed within himself. But the attempt failed because Octavian did not carry the shadows of Caesar or Antony. He was the logos of a new era, an archetype of civic reason, austerity, and cold order. He was fully integrated in his animus, power, hierarchy, discipline, and had repressed his anima, emotion, intuition, so completely that Cleopatra's Eros found no place to anchor. Octavian did not see Cleopatra. He saw a political object to be paraded in Rome. His immunity to seduction was not moral, it was psychic. Her Eros crashed against a wall of glacial logos, and this forced upon Cleopatra a ruthless revelation. Her truth could no longer be validated by men. The failure of her seduction was not merely a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of her last projection of the self. She realized that the totality she chased did not lie in union with Rome, but in radical separation from it. In this moment of absolute rejection, Cleopatra was pushed into a choice that transcended politics: to abandon the need to be believed, understood, or redeemed. This separation, though brutal, was essential. She understood that her truth could not be validated by minds trapped in old dualities. The Roman mind that saw power only as conquest and order. To them, she was too emotional, too mystical, too visionary. New labels for the ancient fear of the sacred feminine. Her journey toward solitude was not abandonment. It was an act of preservation of the self. By withdrawing, she shielded the purity of her final message from the judgment of dogma. The void that followed was not a void of meaning, but a void of external dependency. No more hierarchy, no more need for masculine approval. She became her own spiritual authority. She had to purge the final residue of the expectation of masculine validation. Octavian's rejection taught her what neither Caesar nor Antony ever could. Wholeness is internal and non-transferable. Her surrender to the void was not defeat. It was her victory over the fear of not belonging. Her dread of being paraded in Rome was the dread of being reduced, simplified, robbed of her human complexity. The totality she found was the one treasure she carried from her empire. Eros and Logos were united at last, not in a political marriage, but in a personal choice. The courage to be wholly herself, to embrace her shadow, and to claim her autonomy. Her mission became to carry the legacy of feeling, the truth that real strength comes from inner unity, even when the world demands fragmentation. Cleopatra was liberated from the need to fit into outdated structures of power or affection. She became the archetype of the pilgrim, the woman who carries sacred truth along the world's thresholds, though her final threshold was that of death. The decision was made. Cleopatra, the dethroned queen, now possessed one final non-negotiable treasure: her spiritual sovereignty. She had to die to preserve her right to self-definition, to deny Octavian the right to touch her, bind her, parade her. Physical separation ensured that her truth remained pure, untouched by the hunger for external validation. But how would the queen who commanded kingdoms make her last declaration of independence? The answer lay in the oldest, most potent symbol of the Egyptian primordial feminine, the one force that refuses subjugation. She had integrated her animus to choose death with clarity. She had accepted her anima to choose mystery with serenity. But what does the serpent, the emblem of the primordial feminine, represent at the end? And how is its bite the archetypal equivalent of the command, "Noli me tangere," do not touch me? This is the key to her final liberation. After Octavian's cold rejection, Cleopatra faced an absolute, crystalline certainty. The only way to preserve her spiritual sovereignty and her totality, the self, was through a death she herself chose. Her suicide was not despair, it was defiance. A final act of autonomy against Rome's conquering logos. To execute this act, she turned to the oldest, most potent symbol of Egypt, the serpent, the asp. Across ancient myth, the serpent is the archetype of the primordial feminine, the keeper of hidden knowledge, gnosis, the guardian of cycles, death and rebirth, the voice of the earth, chthonic wisdom. It is the anima in its wildest, untouched form, unbound by masculine rationality. By choosing the serpent, Cleopatra rejected Roman logic and surrendered to the law of her own soul. The snake was not the instrument of death, but the archetypal guide to her liberation. Its venom was the final alchemical transformation of her being. She surrendered herself to the realm of her anima, releasing the earthly dominion of Logos and entering the intuitive wisdom of her ancestral spirit. In the story of Mary Magdalene, the command "Noli me tangere," do not touch me, was the call to withdraw the projection of the self from the external body and reclaim it inwardly. For Cleopatra, the serpent's bite was her version of this command. In her mind, she spoke to Octavian, to Rome, and to the collective shadow that condemned her. Do not touch me, not in your terms, not in your hierarchy. Do not force me into your old structures of power or affection. My totality is internal now. I carry it with me. Octavian's physical touch, his desire to parade her as a trophy through Rome, was the final fragmentation of her soul. To be touched by him was to be reduced back into the sinner, the captive lover, the woman defined by men. The touch she denied, the touch of external definition, the persona imposed upon her. The do not touch she affirmed, the untouched core of autonomy, the truth that her essence, her totality, was untouchable and untransferable. With the serpent's bite, Cleopatra became the immortal archetype of a woman who, though defeated politically, achieved the psychological victory of defining herself on her own terms. Her final act sealed her individuation. Acceptance of the shadow. She no longer denied her dependency, her fear of abandonment, her role as the lover. She embraced them. Integration of the animus. She summoned discernment, strength, and decision to choose her own death with strategic clarity. Ascension of the anima. She surrendered to intuition, mystery, and sacred Eros by choosing the symbolic path of the serpent. The totality she achieved was the union of strength and vulnerability. She did not become a religious martyr, she became the paradigm of personal sovereignty. Her body, receiving the venom, became a relic, not by miracle, but by gnosis. She transmitted a message older than Rome. The final healing is spiritual autonomy. The world wanted Cleopatra to carry the message of surrender, but she carried instead the message of the union of opposites and the indivisibility of the self. The serpent's bite was her declaration of independence. She was no longer the lover, no longer the dependent. She became the free woman. Cleopatra completed the deepest transformation a soul can make, yet carrying that totality in a world built on fragmentation was a burden that belonged to the ages. So where does her legacy lead? Her story becomes a mirror for us. What does a queen who lost an empire teach us about the one power that cannot be stolen? And how does her legacy of feeling offer the key to never repeating her error, the error of seeking power in the wrong place? The answer lies in the final restoration of the sacred feminine. Cleopatra, the queen who failed to keep her empire, who failed to master her own love, became in death an archetypal legacy. Her political failure transformed into a psychological victory for everyone who seeks wholeness, the self, in a world built on fragmentation. Her legacy is not biography, it is permission. Permission for women and for the sacred feminine, the anima within every man, to be whole without external validation. She proved that strength is not found in repressing tears, vulnerability, or Eros, as the collective shadow demanded, but in weaving them into wisdom. The power she sought on the battlefield was temporary. The power she found in radical self-acceptance was eternal. Her path is the living proof that the sacred feminine, Eros, must be reclaimed in a world ruled by the rigidity of Logos. Where Logos insists on hierarchy and separation, Cleopatra's Eros, even in tragic defeat, insists on connection and totality. Like Mary Magdalene, Cleopatra became the face of individuation for the feminine principle. Her story reveals that wholeness, the encounter with the self, is not a masculine privilege or a dogmatic gift. It is reached when we dare to integrate the shadow, accepting the lover, the strategist, the dependent, the instincts, the sexuality, the forbidden emotions. Integrating the animus, using strength, clarity, and reason to make final acts of autonomy. Unifying the opposites, letting Logos and Eros merge, so reason supports intuition, and intuition guides reason. Her final separation from her lovers and her chosen death ensured that her message would remain pure. She carried the message of the body, the wisdom that spirit lives within matter, in defiance of any dogma that tried to erase the body or silence feeling. Wholeness, the self, is reached only when we recognize the divinity hidden in our own humanity, with all its failures and all its light. Cleopatra proved that a woman who accepts her vulnerability is, in truth, the strongest of all, because she does not fear the totality of her human experience. Her legacy does not belong to the past. It belongs to our present. Her story is the mirror reflecting how fiercely our modern collective shadow still tries to fragment us. How many times are we called too emotional, too much, too visionary, when we are simply expressing our sacred feminine? Cleopatra's wisdom distills into one psychological command: accept your shadow. not to be punished, but to reclaim the power it protects. The final healing is spiritual autonomy. You are your own authority. You are your own proof. Cleopatra's call is for all of us, men and women, to rescue the anima and the Eros that were exiled. It is a call to trust intuition in the face of logical pressure, to value feeling as a legitimate form of knowledge. Her legacy reminds us that the most radical act of faith is often believing in yourself. Cleopatra gave us the key to totality, not a golden key, but a key of radical acceptance. Her journey ends where every true journey begins, inside us. She gave us the legacy of the shadow and of the sacred feminine. But a key must be used. What will you do with the truth she left? And if this story stirred the shadow within you, if you feel the pull to reclaim your voice and your inner wholeness, your soul work, your shadow work, begins now. Cleopatra's journey ends where every true journey begins, within us. She failed to hold external power, yet in her death she placed in our hands the key to wholeness. Cleopatra, the bearer of the sacred feminine, who sought power through union, revealed that our greatest danger is not the judgment of the world, the collective shadow, but the judgment of ourselves. The refusal to honor our own Eros, our own feeling, our own intuition. Her legacy is not meant to be admired from afar. It is meant to be lived. The wholeness she achieved is the same self waiting to be uncovered within you. Her story is a mirror, asking, which part of you was silenced by society? What power did you exile into the shadow just to be seen as acceptable or strong? Strength is not repression. Strength is wholeness. She proved that the final healing is spiritual autonomy. You are your own authority. You are your own proof. If Cleopatra's story touched the shadow you carry, if you feel the call to reclaim your voice and your inner wholeness, your soul work, your shadow work must begin now. Wholeness is your destiny. To continue your own individuation, subscribe to Shadow Work Stories and tap the bell so you don't miss the next archetypal descent. Our channel isn't just about stories. It's about turning what hurts into wisdom and what was silenced into voice. Leave your like if you too believe in the power of wholeness, and click the video on your screen to continue your journey of the self and discover the next archetype waiting to be integrated.